You are standing at the edge of the Tingir Desert in northern China, and in front of you is a wall of trees that stretches farther than your eye can follow. It looks like a victory. It looks like humans finally beat the sand. But if you walk into that forest and dig down with your hands, you find something that stopped me cold when I first read about it. The soil underneath is bone dry, drier than the open desert nearby, and the water table has dropped so far that the trees are slowly killing themselves. Here's what I found after weeks of digging. The biggest tree planting campaign in human history, a green wall meant to stop the desert, ended up drying out the very land it was supposed to save, and the scientists who once cheered it are now quietly saying it went wrong. This is not a rumor. This is documented in Chinese research stations that have been studying this sand since the 1950s. And there is a forgotten method, a cheap trick made of nothing but dead straw that worked better than billions of trees ever did. I found the exact station where it was invented, the exact year, and the reason it was pushed aside. Stay with me, because by the end you will understand why the simplest fix was buried under the most expensive mistake, and you will see how the same mistake shows up in your own backyard. Let me take you back to where my thread started. I was reading about desertification late one night, expecting a simple story about heroes planting trees. The number that stopped me was this. Since 1978, China has been building something called the 3 North Shelter Belt Program, nicknamed the Great Green Wall. The plan was to plant a belt of forest almost 3,000 miles long, and to keep planting until the year 2050, tens of billions of trees. It is the most ambitious environmental project ever attempted by any country, and for years the headlines were glorious. Sand held back, green where there was yellow. But then I found a single sentence in a research summary that did not fit the happy story. It said that in one province, a huge share of the planted trees had died, and that the survivors were making the groundwater problem worse. That sentence did not add up. How do you plant trees to save land and end up harming it? So I pulled the thread, and it kept coming. Here is the first clue, and it is the one almost nobody talks about. Trees are thirsty. A single mature poplar, the fast-growing tree that planters loved, can drink many gallons of water every single day. In a wet climate, that is fine, because the rain refills what the tree takes, but the edge of a desert is not a wet climate. In these regions, rainfall can be less than 8 inches a year and sometimes far less. The land simply cannot pay the water bill that a thick forest demands. So what happens? The trees send their roots down and pull water out of the deep ground faster than the rain can replace it. Scientists at the Chinese Academy of Sciences measured this. In several planted areas, the water table dropped year after year. In some spots near the Muas sandy land, researchers recorded the underground water level falling by multiple feet over just a couple of decades. The forest was quietly draining the savings account of the entire landscape. And here's the part that made my stomach turn. As the water table dropped, the deep-rooted native shrubs and grasses that had survived in that desert for thousands of years began to die too. Those native plants had learned to live on almost nothing, but they could not compete with a thirsty imported forest sucking the ground dry. So the trees did not just struggle, they took the old survivors down with them. That is the first piece of the puzzle. Now let me show you why the trees themselves started dropping dead, because that clue points straight at the people who designed this. Picture a field where every single plant is exactly the same. Same species, same age, same height, planted in perfect rows like corn. To a planner filling out a report, that looks like efficiency. To nature, it looks like a buffet with the doors wide open. This is the second clue, and it is where I started to see that the failure was not bad luck. It was baked into the design from the beginning. In the 1990s, in the region around Ningxia, something happened that should be taught in every school that trains people to manage land. Planters had put in vast plantations of a single type of poplar, chosen because it grew fast and looked impressive quickly. Then a beetle arrived. The Asian longhorn beetle, a wood-boring insect, found this endless identical forest and treated it like an all-you-can-eat feast. With no variety to slow it down, the infestation exploded. By the estimates I found, roughly 1 billion poplar trees died and had to be cut down across the affected regions. 1 billion. Years of labor, gone in a wave of insects, because everything was the same. This is what ecologists call a monoculture, and there is an old, plain-spoken piece of farming wisdom that warned about this centuries ago. Do not put all your eggs in one basket. Old farmers knew that a mixed field survives what a single crop cannot. When one plant catches a disease, the others form gaps that stop it from spreading. Diversity is insurance. The planters threw that insurance away because a single fast species produced quick, photogenic results, and quick results were what the reports rewarded. Therefore, the deeper I dug, the more I realized the trees were never really planted for the land. They were planted for the numbers. And now we reach the part I could not stay calm about. Because once you see who benefited from planting the wrong thing the fast way, you cannot unsee it. Follow the incentive, and the whole strange story finally makes sense. For decades, success in these campaigns was measured one way. How many trees did you plant? Not how many survived, not how healthy the soil was 5 years later, not whether the water table held, just the raw count of saplings pushed into the ground in a single season. When you reward people for the number of trees planted, you get exactly that. Enormous numbers of trees, planted fast, planted cheap, planted without asking whether that spot could ever support a forest at all. I found survival estimates that are genuinely shocking. In some of the early and mid-period plantings, independent reviews suggested that as few as 15% of the trees were still alive years later. Think about that. For every 100 trees planted with real labor and real money, well over half, sometimes 80 or more, were dead. But on paper, on the report that traveled up the chain, all 100 counted as a triumph. The gap between the paper forest and the real forest is where all the money and all the water quietly drained away. And here is who profited from the gap. Nurseries that sold billions of saplings got paid for every one, whether it lived or died. Contractors were paid to plant, not to nurture. Officials were promoted for hitting planting targets, not for admitting that a stretch of true desert should never have been forested in the first place. The system paid everyone to plant and paid no one to tell the truth. So the truth waited, buried, for the research stations to slowly measure what was really happening underground. This is the moment the story stops being about China and starts being about you, because the exact same mistake is sold to ordinary homeowners every single year. You are told to green your yard by planting the fastest growing, thirstiest, most impressive looking thing at the garden center. You water it constantly. You fight the pests that swarm your single showy species. You are running your own tiny great green wall, and you are losing water and money for the same reason the big one failed. Hold that thought, because in a few minutes I am going to hand you the cheap fix that the desert scientists themselves rediscovered. And every one of those failures had a quieter, older alternative that actually worked. That is what I went looking for next. And it led me to a dusty railway line and a man laying down squares of straw by hand in the 1950s. If this way of thinking resonates with you, the same approach I use in every investigation on this channel, chasing the buried method instead of the expensive one, is something I have gone much deeper on in my book. It is called First Wins, and it lays out the full framework, the same one I call deep leverage, for finding where the humble, forgotten fix outperforms the dramatic solution across every area of your life, not just your garden. The complete picture is in the full system, and you can find all the details in the description below. Read the first few pages and you will recognize the pattern immediately. Now, back to the desert. But first I have to show you the third clue, the one about the airplanes, because it reveals just how far the fast and impressive thinking went. In their push to cover ground quickly, planters in some regions turned to aerial seeding. They loaded seeds into aircraft and flew over the dunes, scattering them across thousands of acres in a matter of hours. On a map, you could color in an enormous area as treated in a single afternoon. It looked like the future. The trouble is that a seed dropped from a plane onto bare, shifting sand has almost no chance. It needs the sand to hold still long enough to root. It needs a shred of moisture at the surface. It needs to not be eaten or blown into a dune overnight. In loose, moving sand with brutal wind and almost no rain, the failure rate was staggering. Vast amounts of seed simply vanished into the desert with nothing to show for it. The method worked in a few gentler spots, and there it genuinely helped, but it was used far beyond where it made any sense, because covering area fast was the whole point. So now I had 3 clues pointing the same direction. Thirsty trees draining the water, identical forests dying in waves, seeds flung from the sky onto sand that could never hold them. Every single failure came from the same root, the obsession with fast, big, and visible over slow, small, and alive. And every one of those failures had a quieter, older alternative that actually worked. That is what I went looking for next, and it led me to a dusty railway line and a man laying down squares of straw by hand in the 1950s. Here is the paradox that cracked the whole case open for me. The single most successful desert control method in modern China was not invented in the era of billion-tree campaigns and airplanes. It was invented decades earlier, and it uses no living plant at all in the first step. It is made of dead wheat straw, and it costs almost nothing. When I first read how simple it was, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. I had not. Let me take you to the place. In the 1950s, China was trying to build a railway line from Baotou to Lanzhou, and it had to cross the edge of the Tengger Desert at a spot called Shapotou in the Ningxia region. The problem was obvious and seemed impossible. The sand dunes moved. Wind pushed them right across the tracks, burying the rails again and again. You cannot run trains across a desert that keeps swallowing the line. Every clever engineer said the same thing. The sand must be stopped, or the railway is dead. The researchers at what became the Shapotou Desert Research Station tried the expensive answers first, but then they landed on something almost embarrassingly humble. They took ordinary wheat straw and rice straw, the leftover stalks from harvest that farmers usually burned or threw away, and they pushed it into the sand in a grid pattern. They laid out squares, roughly 1 meter by 1 meter, and jammed the straw halfway into the sand so it stood up in little walls along the edges of each square. From above, the desert looked like a giant sheet of graph paper. And this is the genius of it. Each little square breaks the wind right at the surface. Wind is what moves sand, and wind moving across open dunes builds up speed and lifts the grains. But wind hitting a checkerboard of straw walls gets chopped into tiny, weak eddies inside each square. The sand in that square has nowhere to go. It settles, it stays put. The straw does not need to be alive. It just needs to stand there and break the wind. And dead straw does that beautifully for years. Then something even better happens, and this is the part that made me sit back in my chair. The straw squares create a tiny sheltered pocket in each cell. Blowing dust and organic bits collect there. The surface stops shifting, and because the sand finally holds still, natural seeds that blow in can actually take root. A thin living crust of moss and tiny organisms, what scientists call a biological soil crust, begins to form on the stabilized surface. The dead straw invites life back on its own terms, slowly, with native plants suited to that exact spot, using only the water the sky actually provides. It does not force a thirsty forest onto land that cannot feed one. It sets the table and lets the desert heal itself. Studies from the Shapotou Station, which has been running continuously for more than 60 years, showed that these straw checkerboards held the sand in place and let the railway run safely across the desert for decades. It is still there. It still works. It became so respected that it has been shared as a model for fighting desertification in other countries. This was the answer sitting in plain sight the entire time. So why, I kept asking myself, did the giant campaigns lean so hard on thirsty trees and airplanes instead of the humble straw grid that was already proven? The answer is the ugly heart of this whole investigation, and it is the same answer that keeps you overpaying in your own life. The straw checkerboard has no glory in it. Nobody gets a heroic photo standing next to a square of dead stalks. It does not produce an impressive count of trees for a report. It cannot be finished in a single afternoon from an airplane. It requires patient, careful, low-status hand labor, and it produces slow, quiet, real results instead of fast, loud, fake ones. In a system that rewarded the appearance of action over the substance of it, the boring method that actually worked got sidelined for the dramatic method that mostly did not. Now, I promised you something, and this is exactly the moment to deliver it. Maybe you have been listening to all this thinking it is fascinating but far away, a problem for scientists in a distant desert, nothing to do with your yard, your budget, or your evening. Maybe you are thinking you are too busy to fix your soil, or that you would need special plants or equipment you do not own. I put this next part in specifically for you, because the core trick behind the straw checkerboard is something you can use tonight with things already sitting in your home, and it costs you nothing. Here is the principle, stripped down to what matters. Bare ground is losing ground. Any patch of open soil in your garden, in your flower bed, around your vegetables, is a patch that is losing water to the air and losing its top layer to the wind and rain, exactly like a bare dune. The Shapotou researchers prove that you do not stop that loss by adding something thirsty and dramatic on top. You stop it by covering the surface with dead plant material that breaks the wind and holds the moisture in. So tonight, go collect the dead plant matter you already have and would normally throw away. The dried grass clippings from your last mow, the fallen leaves piling up at the edge of your yard, the straw from a package, even shredded plain cardboard or newspaper. Lay it over your bare soil in a layer a couple of inches thick, right around your existing plants, leaving a little gap at the stems. That is it. That is a homemade version of the same principle. You have just cut the water evaporating from that soil dramatically. University Extension Services have measured this for decades. A simple mulch layer can reduce water loss from the soil surface by well over half, and it keeps the ground cooler in summer heat and stops the crust that sheds rain instead of soaking it. You did not buy a thirsty showpiece plant. You did not install anything. You used the dead material you were about to discard, and you gave your soil the exact protection that let a desert railway survive for 60 years. Do that this week, and in one growing season you will water less, weed less, and watch your soil turn darker and richer as life moves back into it. That is the forgotten wisdom working in your hands tonight. But I saved the best piece for last, because there is one more layer to this story that the research stations uncovered, and it flips everything you think you know about fighting a desert. Here is the final revelation, and I found it woven through the long-term records of these desert stations and the newer thinking that grew out of admitting the mistakes. For decades, the entire goal was stated as a fight: beat the desert, conquer the sand, push the green wall forward, and drive the yellow back. And that framing, that war framing, is exactly what produced the thirsty forests and the dead airplanes of seed. Because if you are at war with the desert, you try to erase it, to replace it entirely with something green and lush that does not belong there. And the land pushes back by killing what you forced onto it. The buried insight, the one the scientists now say they wish they had honored from the start, is this: you are not supposed to erase the desert. You are supposed to stabilize it and then step back. The straw checkerboard does not create a forest. It creates stillness. And in that stillness, the land chooses its own recovery at its own pace, with the sparse, tough, water-wise native plants that were always meant to live there. The goal is not maximum green. The goal is living ground that can feed itself on the rain that actually falls. A thin scattering of native shrubs on stable soil is a success. A dense imported forest draining the water table to death is a failure, no matter how green it looks in a photograph. Researchers now have a name for the beautiful disaster this investigation has been circling. They call it the Green Desert, a place that is covered in identical planted trees, that looks lush and alive from a car window, but underneath has almost no diversity, a collapsing water table, dying soil, and no future. It is green on the surface and dead underneath. It is the perfect symbol of choosing appearance over life. And the cure was never more trees. The cure was less ambition and more humility. Stabilize, protect, and let the native life return on its own. And that is the piece you can carry into your own yard, your own life, far beyond gardening. The lesson those desert stations paid for with billions of dead trees and decades of drained water is that you do not force a lush ideal onto ground that cannot support it. You work with what the place actually is. You protect the surface, you keep what is native and tough and already adapted, and you resist the expensive, thirsty, dramatic fix that somebody profits from selling you. The straw squares at Shapotou have held the line for more than 60 years using the stalks a farmer would have burned. The green wall of glamorous trees is being quietly rethought, tree by dying tree. The humble method won, it just never got the headline. Let me tie the last knot because I want you to see how completely the evidence lines up now. The trees died because they were too thirsty for the land. The forests collapsed because they were all identical. The seeds vanished because they were flung at sand that could not hold them. And all three happened because the people in charge were rewarded for fast, big, and visible instead of slow, small, and alive. Meanwhile, a station in Ningxia had already solved the real problem in the 1950s with dead straw laid in 1-meter squares by patient hands, and that solution was too humble to get the glory it deserved. Every clue points to the same quiet truth. The cheap, forgotten, boring method was the one that actually worked. What I keep coming back to is how familiar this feels, because it is the same pattern that quietly drains your wallet every year. You are steered toward the expensive, impressive, high-maintenance option, and steered away from the simple thing your grandparents did for free, not because the expensive thing works better, but because somebody gets paid when you choose it. A desert taught me that lesson at a scale of billions of trees. Your garden can teach it to you this weekend at the scale of a single handful of dead leaves. You made it to the end of this trail with me, and that tells me something about who you are. You are the kind of person who does not take the glossy story at face value, who digs under the surface to see whether the green is real or just painted on, who would rather have the humble truth that works than the impressive lie that fails. That instinct is worth more than any product anyone can sell you, and it is exactly what the planners of that green wall forgot to use. So here's my question for you, and I really do want you to answer it. Think about the straw checkerboard, those simple 1-meter squares of dead stalks that held back a desert for 60 years. Is there a slow, humble, old-fashioned method your own family used to do by hand? Something everyone around you now pays for instead? Tell me about it in the comments. I read them, and I chased down the best leads for future investigations. Do not just nod and scroll. Type it out, because someone else reading it tonight might need exactly that piece of forgotten wisdom. If this pulled you in, come deeper with me. This channel is a small, growing group of people who are quietly recovering the practical knowledge that got buried under expensive replacements and who refuse to keep paying for what should be simple. Subscribe and stand with us, because the next thread I am pulling is a strange one. I found an old home economics record showing that people used to keep certain foods fresh for months on a shelf, no refrigerator, no power, using one cheap mineral that is still sitting in most kitchens right now. I am tracking down where that knowledge went and who made us forget it. You are not going to want to miss what the water table taught me, applied to the food in your own pantry. Stay with me and let us keep digging. Before you go, one thing. Inside my membership, the Practical Wisdom Circle, I continue this exact video walking you through the straw checkerboard method step by step. In there, you can ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel anytime with one click, no risk. Come join me.